Hello and welcome to the FluCoMa podcast. Today I'm talking with Darlene Castro Ortiz, who is a composer and also classical guitarist based at the University of Chicago, where she is currently working on her PhD in composition. So much of Darlene's compositional work looks at the idea of sonification and creating sonic representations of non-musical objects. Her work has been performed and commissioned by many different ensembles, such as the Spectral Quartet, the Running Flutes, and the Salty Cricket Composers Collective, to name but a few. Today, we'll be learning about Darlene's practice and also the progress of her latest project, which makes use of some of the FluCoMa tools. So Darlene, hello, and thank you for talking with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Quite welcome. So I've read that you've been interested in music from an early age, playing violin, playing in a youth mariachi band, and then somewhat classical orchestra setting. So perhaps you could begin by telling us how you got into the musical world and also how you transitioned from the classical world to a more noisier setting.
Yeah, I know I have this really vivid memory of a field trip in third grade to go see this orchestra performing. Our music teacher at the time was an oboist with the community orchestra, and I don't know how much of it is me glorifying or having a very romantic ideal of this, but I do remember I was so impressed by this experience, and I very much latched onto the violin. My parents at the time couldn't lessons. We also lived in a really small town, so in Indiana, so things were kind of limited, and I was pretty much my only real option was the public school system and sort of the music programs they had. My elementary school at the time didn't have an orchestra program or a really robust music program. I think as far as it got was we learned to read music and play the recorder. And so I basically had to wait until middle school. They did do a visit in fifth grade and I was able to try the instruments. And then I remember really being okay, I really like the violin, at least compared to a clarinet or a flute that I also tried. And that summer, when I started middle school, we moved to Texas, which is Corpus Christi, about 2 hours from the border, 2 or 3 hours from the border with Mexico. And the middle school I went to there didn't have an orchestra, a band program, but they did have this small mariachi band. And so basically I was okay, I want to do this. At least this is one way to get myself to in a sort of violin setting. So I got into the class and the teacher was oh, do you know how to play violin? And I said, I have no idea. And he basically just let me pick a violin and gave me the sheet saying, here are all the fingerings. This is how you play a violin. Here you go. And so I kind of learned how to play the violin with all these. They're somewhat a familiar setting because these are all sort of folk songs that are very common in the Mexican heritage and culture. So at least that way I had a sort of some way to grasp onto learning the violin. My mom worked for the school district as a lunch lady. And so she was actually able to transfer me to the school where she worked. And they had an orchestra program there. Mm-hmm. And so for the next 2 years, I was in the orchestra there and had a great time. I had this really cool teacher. He would dress up in a suit for every day for class, and he was so proper, and it was a lot of fun. And I do have kind of this vague snippet of a memory of composing some violin melodies in 8th grade. But I think that was maybe the earliest I ever sort of did. And then for high school, we moved to Utah, and the school I was assigned to didn't have an orchestra program. It was very bad luck on my end, but luckily my mom heard, I think it was a radio announcement that there was this free charter high school for the performing arts in the city. And so she was okay, if you really want to do this, let's go enroll you. I think I only went to the other school for one day, and then the next day I was enrolled at the performing arts high school. And so I took all my classes all my core classes science and math at the high school where we were based. And then all my electives were part of this sort of charter performing arts high school. And so I took 2 years of music theory. And then they had a composition class that I started taking in 10th grade. And I kind of repeated that class all through my senior year. The first year was kind of when we got this instruction on form and sort of what to do with melody. and how to work with harmony. It was taught by the same teacher who taught theory. So it was very sort of interlocked with the things we learned in the theory class. So we also did composing in the theory class. And then when you repeated the class, it was kind of more of a free-for-all. You know, the class kind of divided into those who had taken it already and those who hadn't. And so we kind of formed our own groups and had some working time in that class, and the teacher would come around and give us feedback, and we would give each other feedback. So yeah, I had a good 3 years of just kind of having this class where I could compose. And I think at least sort of caught my attention more than the violin. That teacher also was leading a classical guitar ensemble class. And so I really wanted to take another class with him because I had to fill up my electives. And that's kind of when I started moving over to the classical guitar, because it was, it's just an instrument capable of more polyphony, and there's so much more color possibilities with it at the time than with violin, I thought, even though, you know, they both have their merits. And so, yeah, I kind of had that sort of classical guitar training where important, and there's also a bit of a noisy element with like some of the rasguedo strums. So I think that kind of got me thinking about noise, or about at least parameters of music outside of just pitch. And then in my theory class, we started talking about serialism and sort of set theory, and that really piqued my interest in dissonance, which is a very sort of tame version of noise kind of. So I think I always had that like in the background. And we also took, you know, like the music appreciation class where we, you know, were introduced to George Crumb and Penderecki's, you know, Threnody for the victims of Hiroshima. And so, yeah, I kind of like, the more I got that a sort of world, I was like, oh, I really, really am enjoying this. This is kind of where I want to go. And then it wasn't until I got to my undergrad in my second year that we took, we had to take a music technology class and then an electronic composition class, where I actually was like exposed to all these tools that I could finally use. And I was like, oh, okay, this is like really expanding my vocabulary for what I want to do. And that's kind of when I really latched on to sort of doing more noisier things, or being more interested in exploring noisier textures and noisier techniques.
So you had to take music technology as part of your course in undergrad. Yeah, that's interesting, because yeah, where I did my undergrad, it was an option that you could do if you're interested. Yeah, so yeah, it sounds like you were really on that musical path from a very young age, and it sounds like your parents were quite supportive of that as well.
Yeah, my mom was incredible. She was really on it, and she did whatever she could to like really support that. Yeah,
that's great to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So you've written that sonification is a big interest in for your compositional work, and the idea of musical translations. So this is an idea that could be approached many different ways. I'd like to hear about how you approach this idea, both technically and aesthetically. So how do you practically approach this notion in your work, but also how do you conceptualize these techniques as a composer?
Yeah, during my undergrad, I was coming out of this very like practical and kind of gritty training of like, okay, this is how you do things. You need to learn how to handle musical objects. And so it wasn't really until the first PhD, because I went straight from my bachelor's into my PhD, that I really had to do some like self-reflection on myself as an artist and like my artistic practice. We usually the first years have to present on their work to the current students, and so it really forced me to like be like, okay, what am I all about? What am I sort of, how do I want to sell myself, I guess, to the music department? And so I kind of noticed that there was this thread of extra musical inspiration in a lot of my work. And so I was like, okay, that's something I can sort of look deeper into. And as I was looking into it and sort of kind of doing a self-analysis on my pieces, I noticed that with the specific subjects of extra musical inspiration I was working with, there was this really familiar feeling that comes with being fully bilingual and not being able to translate between two languages in like a way that is satisfactory. There's always this like I don't know, this extra like knowledge, this extra texture to certain words or certain sayings that don't quite fit in all the way. Um, and so I noticed that that was kind of a driving force in how I approach music. So it was nice to kind of have like, finally have something that I could be like, okay, this is kind of what I'm about. And so a lot of the ways that I noticed that I kind of did that and continued to do that is mostly by just mapping sort of like elements of the extra musical subjects that I'm working with onto like their musical equivalents, which of course is like filtered through my own sort of interpretation. Some of it is very sort of one-to-one kind of self-explanatory. Some of it is more subtle, kind of like, of course, dealing with more interpretation. But in this mapping, I kind of try to create a shared vocabulary or almost like a table of translation between the extra musical and the sort of musical objects that I wanted to work with. So one piece that really comes to mind is desmoronamiento, which in Spanish means it's like a crumbling. And I mean, I grew up bilingual, and so at home we just speak Spanish. My parents are from Mexico, and then all of education and schooling and then the music world I was sort of engrossed in was all in English. And so these two worlds, like sort of explaining things to my mom, because I to this day I kind of only speak to her in Spanish, is like it's so hard for me to find that the words in Spanish. And then equally, like when talking about my home life, it's so hard to sometimes find those words in English to sort of describe that. And so sometimes I'll like hear words in Spanish that I maybe wasn't exposed to, and they'll just sound so rich to me because they're, you know, they're in a new sort of context. And this word was one of those. And so I thought, okay, like as soon as I heard it, it was like, I feel like I hear like crumbling concrete and like all this like dusty granular stuff. And so that was just like a more sort of subtle interpretation sort of through my ears of what that was like. So I just basically deconstructed what goes into creating a flute sound with air noises, and sort of the difference between the sort of like spectrum between the noisiness of the air pushing through, resulting into the final sort of pitch state and everything in between. I have another piece that's more of direct in that goal called All at Once, which is actually for a flute choir for 12 flutes. Is amazing. Sounds like a big organ. And I based that on this kind of I wanted to like do like a minimalism study, I guess. This was like back in like my junior year of undergrad. And I wanted to kind of do minimalism, but kind of do it in a way that was interesting to me. And so I thought, you know, the sort of slower changing texture and sort of nature of minimalism would be a great medium to translate the experience of seeing a painting, because it's all kind of there, and then you can sort of zoom into different sections. And so I had the orchestra choir basically playing this huge block of texture, and then I would kind of pull lines out of it. And so that was a very kind of one-to-one, easier sort of translation or mapping. I also have a wind quintet that actually hasn't been performed to this day, but it's called lienzos, which is like means canvas in Spanish. And each movement was based on a painting or a sculpture. And so I mapped a lot of density, like the sort of dense, one is a sculpture that's basically just like electric tape that's kind of like almost mimicking these like three-dimensional ink splatters. And so there are these nodes of like density and then these kind of things that come out like spider webs. And so I took, I kind of just kind of flattened that through time, where I have these like dense blocks and then I have these sort of wispier things coming out of those blocks. So that of course was also a more one-to-one sort of mapping. Another is like for snare drum trio, palomitas, which means, actually it's a word that has three meanings. It means doves, it means firecrackers, and it means popcorn. And so I was really leaning into like the sound worlds of all of those words in Spanish. So like soft rustling of dove wings and like the popping of popcorn, the dry sort of popping of popcorn, and then this like louder firecracker popping with the snare drums. And then one of the more recent pieces I did was blend for string quartet and percussion. And this was definitely much more of a transliteration, I guess I would say. I was more familiar with, extended techniques and ways of orchestrating all of these noisy things I wanted to have in my music. And so, what we would call like timbral modulation now. I just basically thought of it as of the string quartet and the percussion as these two like speakers of their own language, and then they would speak each other's language with like an accent. So like the string quartet would try to sound like the percussion. I had the percussion try to sound like the strings, and so that was, I think, one of the kind of like a meeting point of like all that I had kind of learned and actually using research I had done in extended techniques, as opposed to just kind of like it being this more interpretive, sort of subtle mapping.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. A lot of what you're saying is resonating with me personally as well, because my parents are English, but I grew up in France, so I'm bilingual, and I've certainly experienced those kind of things that you're talking about. I'm interested to know if those kinds of ideas are part of the creative process. So obviously they're part of the creative process, but is that something that you want your audience to be very aware of? Is it something that just the piece emerges from it and then you present the piece to the audience, or are you going to make the audience very aware of how this piece came into being?
Yeah, I like making the audience aware just because it gives them something to hang on to. And at first I was very sort of stringent on like, no, this piece has to exist outside of its explanation. And I think that has, some merit to a certain extent for some people, but I think I really enjoy, giving really immersing people in this sort of world and where I'm coming from. And, at the end of the day, music is just how we oralize our experiences and our tastes. And, why not give them something to supplement, how you work and what you want the outcome to be.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned some of your pieces there. So it is interesting to note that a lot of your work is written for instrumentalists with live processing sometimes. So I'm curious to hear about your approach for working with and writing for other musicians, and also perhaps what your relationship with the score is, and how musicians enter into this idea of executing your musical translations.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of reverence for instrumentalists. They are like specialists on a level that I could never sort of achieve to be on. And so I definitely take their input and their ability to interpret my music very sort of seriously. And I take all that into consideration. There's been times when I have something intended and they don't exactly interpret it in the way that I was imagining, but it still sounds like what I want because maybe they've been informed by the rest of my piece, or maybe it's just, something they suggest. But yeah, I'm really open to letting the instrumentalists, guide the work. There have been times where I do that more literally by having like the box notation and having timings of like do this here, do this there, and then in workshops we kind of finesse that sound. But yeah, to a certain extent I'm like I would say like 70% of my process is like once the piece leaves me it's kind of not mine anymore. I can obviously give some input and give some direction, but at the end of the day it's them on stage. I've kind of done my work. And so I think, they're as much, I welcome them into the sort of like, into the creation process after the piece has been composed, because there is a certain amount of creation that does happen when you're working with them to actually, perform it on stage.
Yeah, well, I think a really good way to get into that even more is to talk about this latest project that that you were telling me about, which sounds really fascinating, and also happens to use some of the FluCoMa tools. So yeah, maybe to sort of preface all that, perhaps you could tell us about the project. What are your intentions? What's the context of its creation? And what we'll be seeing and hearing in performance?
Yeah, so I think I've always just loved the pieces about literal sort of shadows and the shadow of a performer. And I've always loved sort of silhouette art and shadow paper art and shadow films, because it's so intriguing to see this outline of something happening, but there are all these details that you don't know about, what the things that are moving actually look like, or what they're sort of the extent of which the actions that are happening. Like I know that's a common sort of technique in film, right? When you don't want to show anything too gory, you kind of go onto the wall where you see the shadows. Or so it's like it almost makes it more horrific, because you're then imagining like the worst possible thing happening to these like silhouettes. So yeah, there's like this really strange imbalance of information, I guess, that I'm really drawn to about shadows, and this air of mystery there. And I wanted to find some way to sort of to bring that to my artistic practice. And one way that I guess, or the main way that I'm formulating that in this project is in that essentially I'm trying to create a touchless interface that takes a performer's shadow as input data. So I'll have a sort of a muslin screen, and it'll be embedded with phototransistors, which if you cover them or uncover them, they're exposed to light, and that is taken as analog data. And then, yeah, basically it'll be there almost like an empty canvas for the performer to have their shadow projected on. And then the motion that they create and the shadows they create as they're moving while playing their instrument will then sort of generate the data that will then be taken and mapped onto parameters for like granular. What I'm doing right now is with granular synthesis and delays for parameters of that, and sort of processing their actual live sound, the live sound of the motions they are making that then go into, so it's like this feedback kind of loop. They'll be, I'm imagining them being closely mic'd. And so only, I guess the audience can't hear much of their actual acoustic sound. They'll just be seeing the motions, and then they'll be, I'm doing this because I'm imagining it as a violin right now, because I play the violin for a little bit. But they'll see this motion and they'll hear, but they'll hear the process sound. So there's also a disconnect there between what they imagine like that motion should sound like, and it comes out as something separate. So yeah, so there'll also be this kind of like air of mystery there, where you see this thing happening if you're familiar with the instrument, but that the actual sonic output is the strange sort of like thing that maybe you're not expecting.
That sounds fascinating. It sounds like also could be extending some of those ideas around translation, that kind of imbalance of information that you were talking about. And so I'm really interested to hear about how you've been developing some of the techniques in this. So one thing that I'd like, so you're using a regressor, so the MLP regressor, I'm imagining. So there are several things in that I'd be interested in hearing. So first of all, for training the regressor and so the different positions of shadows, which is why I was thinking about working with the instrumentalist earlier. How have you gone about training the regressor? Have you been working with the person that's going to be performing the piece, or have you been standing yourself in front? Have you, and also I assume that this muslin screen is going to be quite a big kind of difficult interface to move around and stuff. Have you got that set up in the studio? Are you working with that? How's that process been happening?
Yeah, I had this idea at the kind of a little bit before the pandemic, so I was limited in studio space. So I didn't really get a chance to actually get it up and working until fairly recently. But yeah, I'm sort of it's not quite at least for this first iteration, the phototransistors aren't quite spread out and like they're kind of contained to the performer's outline. And so as they kind of move within and without of that space, that is then kind of what I'm working with now, at least to keep it manageable. I think definitely the natural sort of progress of this is to extend it to like, so that the whole screen is embedded with them. So we have this very sort of much more space to work with. But for right now, it's definitely limited to just the kind of around the outline of a person. And it's been mostly just me because it's been hard to get someone it takes a lot of sort of time to do this. And so it's basically just been me with like a pedal trying to like, I think there's like you just send a bang object like to the regressor and it like saves the setting that you want with the laptop up there. So yeah, it's been a little bit, it's kind of like chasing your own tail, I guess, because you can't move, but then you also have to like adjust the parameters and things. So yeah, but I think that's kind of just a sort of temporary stage because it takes so much time to work with someone else. Eventually I do, once I get a handle of like, okay, these are the sort of the parameters that I want to set with the shadow. I'll then obviously ask someone to sort of come in and be the actual model for that. And then I'll be at the helm sort of controlling it a bit more. But yeah, right now it's mostly just been me, basically chasing my own tail.
Yeah. And so how do you, how does the process of so you say that it's controlling mainly a granulator patch, is that correct?
A granulator patch and a delay, yeah.
Right, okay. And so are you mapping all of the parameters in those patches? And how do you go about the training process? Do you set up a parameter space that is interesting for you and then map it perhaps to an extreme position and then do another and then kind of see those intermediate spaces? Or do you tend to do lots and lots of data? Because there's lots of different approaches to it.
Yeah, I think I definitely start with the sound. So I think about what gesture is necessary for a sound that I'm interested in. And so like if I want to do some like sort of rolling the bow back and forth in this position, then I'll kind of see, first I'll set the parameters of the patch of the granular and the delay patch to a sound that I want. And then, or at least the sort of processing that I want on that sound. And then I'll go and see what the actual analog data is of that sort of position. And then, set it in place as like a boundary of like, okay, when I'm here, I want it to sound like this. And then maybe when I move away from it, I want it to be, say like, I want the density to be maximum here. And then when I'm here, I want it to be a little bit less for the granular patch. I'll set those two, and then everything in between, I'm relying on the regressor to sort of map that. Maybe I'll do something, if that doesn't work and I'm having a lot of like stuff in between that I don't like the sound of, maybe I'll sort of stop halfway and then go like that and sort of give it more fidelity and more definition. But yeah, essentially it's just starting with sound, sort of like stop motioning myself in different positions of like what goes into making that sound, and then setting the parameters, and then finally having those be kind of my boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. And yeah, a term that was, I think it was Rebecca Fiebrink at the last FluCoMa plenary was talking about working with regressors and stuff, and how small data is beautiful, and how small collections of data can allow us to explore those spaces between those extremes and stuff. And yeah, it's a really stimulating way of working.
Yeah, and I definitely, I think that really complements like my approach to working with instrumentalists too, because I'll give them instructions and I'll have this general idea of what I want, but then sort of the more in between things, as long as they kind of follow a general just like description of what I want, that's the sort of spontaneity of it and the creativity of their improvisation is more important to me than these exact sort of rhythms and sounds. So I think this is like the perfect like vehicle for a lot of what I already like doing with instrumentalists.
Yeah. I was interested that you used the term feedback loop earlier, because I don't know if you saw one of the pieces that was at the second FluCoMa concert by Alice Eldridge and Chris Kofer. It was using their feedback cello system. and they also used the regressor to augment this system. So you've got the sound coming out of the cello, which is going through the regressor, which is being mapped to some processing, which is affecting the cello, which is going back into the cello and exciting some of the chords and stuff. And yeah, so they kind of seemed to consider the regressor as this kind of third agent that entered into this loop with them, and that so they've got this loop that they're both exciting at different parts and kind of imparting energy into that, and that the regressor really was its own agent that was also doing that. I was wondering if that had any resonances with you, how you conceptualize this regressor in this system that you've created.
Yeah, it definitely feels like just because of the nature of how I approach working with instrumentalists and like them these sort of extremes of instructions, and then they can do like, you know, smaller individual things in between. It does feel like the regressor is another instrumentalist that I'm working with. And they kind of sort of feed into each other. And it's almost like a duet, I guess they're playing with each other. So yeah, I definitely see the regressor as another sort of instrumentalist that perhaps I have more control over, because I'm, you know, I can define it a bit more, and I can sort of control its feedback maybe in a way that I wouldn't with an instrumentalist, or in a way maybe I would be intimidated to with an instrumentalist. But yeah, I definitely think it's definitely a third agent, both of myself, I think, because I'm directly putting a lot of my own aesthetic, my sort of auditory aesthetic into it, and also of the performer, because they are essentially sort of working within the sort of boundaries that the regressor allows them to, in a way.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, because so that's how you conceptualize of the regressor existing this thing, but also, so from the perspective of the instrumentalist, you have to consider that, you know, as well as playing the notes that they've been asked to play on their instrument, they're also now having to deal with this whole other control parameter, and yeah, I'm interested to know to what extent the movements are going to be scripted and perhaps worked into a score. Are you asking the instrumentalist very precisely to move to certain positions? Is this all happening despite them? Is it another instrument that they're asked to play simultaneously, or are you proposing this as an extension to their instrument?
Yeah, this is definitely an extension of their instrument. I kind of am sort of positing this as a meta instrument in a way, because they're playing it both by feeding it sort of audio data by physically, you know, performing or playing their instrument, but they're also feeding it shadow data, position data. So, you know, they're essentially sort of dealing with these two things. And I guess I'm kind of hoping that by having their shadow there as this sort of like haptic feedback, visual haptic feedback, that will sort of inspire them maybe to move or to sort of think about their instrument in a different way. It's actually something I'm really worried about, because it might sort of encourage them to perform in a way that might be, you know, unnatural, right? Have your wrist up with the bow like this to create different things. But yeah, so this is definitely something that they are very much controlling, at least within the extent of the boundaries that I set for them. I'm definitely hoping to have, you know, when they play sound, it's only the sound that they're playing, and they're sort of controlling the onset of when this processing starts. I want to notate the starts and ends of things, and maybe a little bit of timing in between them. But I definitely I'm sort of encouraging them to explore different physicalities, maybe more physicalities than I am actual sound. Like I do have a set sort of sound vocabulary that I want, so I am notating that and giving instructions for that. But I think I definitely want the sort of movements within that, outside of maybe moving their head or maybe moving their body or leaning or moving their elbows in different ways, that I definitely want to be sort of all up to them, and for them to sort of use that as a chance to explore, you know, how, you know, sound instead of just, you know, using the bow. I guess I'm imagining them kind of not thinking about the sort of sound as much and more thinking about their physicality. You know, once they're kind of set into a sound, they can kind of just rest there and think about other things. Sorry, I'm very,
Yeah.
but yeah, I definitely want it to be something that they do have some control over, at least when it comes to movement. But I think it would be very dishonest to say that I'm not controlling basically everything else outside of that. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Another idea that you mentioned talking before that you were wanting to explore with this piece was that of performer visibility and constraint on stage, which is something I find really interesting. I must say I've not had much chance to kind of participate in any kind of shadow theatre kind of things, but it's a really interesting idea, and I was wondering if you could unpack that.
Yeah, I think the first thing that came to mind was like the orchestra auditions where they have you perform behind a screen. I think that was one big thing that kind of, I don't know if it informed it, but I definitely, I think it definitely, just because I, you know, grew up hearing about this, and it's like a phenomenon we have for a very, you know, unfair reason, but we, you know, have it. I think that's something that really interested me. I don't think I directly want to do like a sort of statement on it, because that's not really what I'm, you know, actively doing. But I am definitely aware that that connotation is there, because it's just, I mean, it's literally an instrumentalist behind the screen. I also think there's this sort of culture with stage performance where, like, you know, with orchestras, everyone is dressed the same. You have everyone in either tuxedos or all, you know, concert black. And then you have, you know, with maybe smaller chamber ensembles, you either have a coordinating color or everyone's wearing all black. And so they kind of disappear into the screen, into this sort of background, and they kind of just become vessels for music. There's a lot of writing about, I forget her name, but she's a pianist, and she wears sort of shorter skirts on stage, so she's showing her legs. You know, she's maybe more comfortable that way, and people are like, oh, that distracts from the music. So there's always this like, yeah, I guess it's also maybe the idea coming out of just like being a woman and being subjected to the male gaze, right? You're always being watched. You're always subjected to, you know, having to be aware of yourself, and I think a lot of that also extends to stage work. And so I think, yeah, just like having the performer both disappear but be visible and be, you know, there to like impart the experience onto the audience, I think is something that's like this really, really interesting tension to play with. Yeah, because you want to be there. I mean, with, I guess maybe the exception of like soloists or like opera sort of stars, where you want them to stand out. But for the most part, at least I imagine, and I've experienced that like performers are sort of expected to sort of like disengage from their appearance and be all about sort of projecting sound out into the audience.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating idea to explore, I think. And so, yeah, so I've never really been in an orchestral context. So this is the first time I've heard about this practice of, so when you go to an audition, they can put you behind a screen. So what's happening? Why do they do that?
So it was for a time to avoid gender discrimination.
Right.
And I think I heard rumors of like going to the extent of even having to put carpet down so that the jury wouldn't hear high heels clicking on the, yeah. So it's, I think it was like an initiative brought on to, you know, even out the sort of like gender disparity of orchestras, you know, mostly favoring male or cis white male sort of performers.
Oh, great. No, it sounds like it's going to be a really, really interesting piece. And do you already have a performer in mind? Or
Um, I haven't formally asked, but yeah, I think I'm between either a violist or a flutist, just because they are full and a lot of their sort of motion is concentrated to this upper sort of half. And so it's a
yeah,
lot more contained. I think it'd be harder to do with a seated instrumental. I guess it could be done, but it just, I think, at least for right now, this sort of first iteration, first run, I definitely see it for a flutist or violist. Yeah.
Well, please, if you're willing to share the code once the project's going, then please share that on the forum. I'm sure that would be really interesting for people to see.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Um, Another piece of work that I wanted to talk with you about that we haven't really mentioned as of yet is the research that you did around historical music notation. So I was wondering if you could talk a little about what it was that you did, and if perhaps maybe some of that work may have informed some of your creative practice.
Yeah, I think a lot of my interest in historical notation stems from just my love of calligraphy. It's kind of one of like the oldest hobbies I have next to, or one of the oldest interests I have next to like music. So I think a lot of what initially drew me to it was just the actual, craft of the lettering and the sort of inking and the working on parchment and everything. But the more I sort of looked into it and thought about it, at least from a composition point of view, I thought, oh, these are essentially just, it's interesting to see from an evolutionary point, how we sort of refined notation and created a way to communicate better with performers in the sort of more detached setting that we have now of stage and composer performer. But I think there's also this sort of interesting, I guess, maybe mindset you have when you're working with different notation systems. In my undergrad, I did this project sort of centered around completing a missing voice of a madrigal by composing it only in the notation of the time, which was white menstrual notation. So it's not too different from our modern notation. There's just no real dynamics, and there are no bar lines. And so you kind of have this like, we don't have, it didn't have the sort of conventional like, you know, uh, editing that makes notation a bit easier, where we sort of show the downbeat and like tie things over so that counting is easier. It doesn't have that. So you're able to see patterns a lot clearer. You're able to map out parallelism and a lot of sort of tools of counterpoint, much more visually apparent in there. And so, yeah, I just basically submerged myself in Renaissance theory and sort of just only working with composing by analyzing the piece in its original notation and then composing through its sort of original notation. And that was sort of a very like a transformative experience, I guess you could say, because it made me realize that how important tools are to composers in crafting our mindset, and like what we might miss if we're working in a specific notation system as opposed to another, and what things might be easier to do in certain systems than others. And so I think that really kind of opened my eyes to exploring other ways of notating things. I mean, I think this is something that all composers sort of contend with, right? Like, how do we work within this system that everyone sort of grew up, everyone, by everyone I mean all the musicians we work with sort of grew up using, but how do we sort of try these new things that maybe aren't, maybe the system doesn't lend itself well to explaining or to showing on a visual scale. And so, yeah, I think that just like led me down this rabbit hole of like, how can I show things in different ways? And actually, that's part of the reason why my wind quintet wasn't performed, because it was this huge experiment in like writing things in different kind of notation styles. And so the wind quintet, I was assigned to perform it. They said they I should rewrite it into an easier sort of way to read, because that was, which I mean is fair. A lot of things would have been, a lot of things were just me wanting to be artistic, and that could have been easily rewritten. But some of the things were worthy of being in the sort of more pictorial way that I depicted it. But yeah, it just got me thinking about just communication and how that shapes how I approach composing from the get-go.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's a shame that it didn't get played for that reason. Because yeah, no, and again, so coming back to this idea of translations and how different systems of communication may not quite get certain aspects across that others can. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting approach. So finally, I'd love to hear sort of just about the future of your work. So obviously you're using quite high level machine learning techniques for this piece. Is this workflow that you've been finding particularly stimulating? Do you see any of the other workflows proposed by the FluCoMa toolkit as being something that you'd like to develop in some of your future work?
Definitely, yeah. I think the thing that's most exciting to me is that there is just this such flexibility in creating interactive environments for people to work within. And so one sort of thing that I'm leaning more towards now that I'm getting a little bit more comfortable with at least two FluCoMa objects so far, the regressor and the classifier, is sort of interactive installations for people to sort of work through and experience. I know I do a lot of sewing and knitting and cross stitch, and so I'm really interested in how I can bring textiles into that sort of world and use textile to create tactile sort of interfaces for people as both a sort of like sensory thing through touch and through sight, right? Working with these like I really want to create this like cross stitch drum set because of the hoops that you can put through that you put onto the cross stitch. And so I think that'd be a lot of fun. And of course that like, you know, is perfect for like, again, a regressor. So yeah, regressor is one thing that's really interesting to me. I also have another sort of like more personal project using the classifier. My cat's really vocal. Her name's Spunky. And I really want to, we've taught her to, when she's hungry, to like say, to meow as met. And it's this really interesting meow that she just did out of nowhere. And we've been trying to train her through that. And so I really want to create this like automatic feeder that will respond to her going met. And then perhaps a little bit more crazily, I want to almost create like maybe like a little translator for her, like for her meows with the classifiers. So I think like you know, both like personal, fun, wacky things and more sort of serious artistic pieces.
Yeah, well, showing the scope of what some of these things can do. Yeah, and yeah, just a shout out to probably know Frida Abtan, who was actually on the first episode of the podcast, who's done some work, not with using FluCoMa tools, but who's done some work with sort of reactive textiles and building installations. Where I think it was a very big kind of tapestry sheet that people could touch, and yeah, that's a really interesting piece as well. Great. Well, thank you so much, Darlene. That was really interesting. I'm really looking forward to seeing how the piece is going to develop. And yeah, if you're okay to share code and stuff, then I'm sure people will be really interested to see how that's progressing on the forums. So all that's left to say, thank you very much, and I shall speak to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure being able to talk to you about all these things. And yeah, thank you for having me.
You're quite welcome. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.